I'm artist Michael Oatman, here to discuss my contribution to the 2020 Regional, a collage-based installation entitled Imitation of Life or The Fossil Record. Typically, I make large-scale installations such as All Utopias Fell, which can be seen at Mass MoCA, or The Birds, which is owned by the Albany Institute. These works are made of hundreds or even thousands of components, but it's rare that I make something that reveals the discrete parts. My primary tools are the X-Acto knife, the cutting mat, and glue. But perhaps my most important instrument is the archive. After making collages for over 35 years, I now have a library of 5,000 books, 1,500 magazines, and the cuttings from these sources are sorted into hundreds of categories. It can be a little overwhelming. So when I isolated on March 8th, like so many other people, I found myself doing an activity akin to spring cleaning. I decided to tackle the archive and bring some much needed new order to it. And along the way, I rediscovered a huge trove of material that was left over from the cutting process, all of the rejected pages. You see, I'm usually looking for one kind of image, illustrations that started out their life as paintings. So the things that were left over were charts and graphs, texts and photographs, about 10 bankers' boxes of that material, or about 10,000 rejected pages. I didn't really set out to make a work as much as to organize, but I began to wonder what I could do with this stuff once it was sorted. And then I discovered a supply of material that I had rescued from a landfill, several thousand discarded paper CD sleeves. I made a square template with a circular viewfinder, and the project was off and running. I think of imitation of life as a kind of paper internet. The viewer is free to move physically and make connections between 100 years of magazine sources from 1920 to 2020. These include Life magazine, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Jet, Ebony, Playboy, the Saturday Evening Post, etc. The title, Imitation of Life, is based on a 1959 Douglas Sirk film, which is a meditation on class, race, and gender. I was introduced to this film 20 years ago by my good friend Don Clemens, and it's become one of my favorites as well. Every project begins somewhere, and it so happens that the first thing that I cut out for this project was the identity for a train car in New York City, IA-76. And this was an interesting prompt to think about including things like texts in the process, because I had been focusing primarily on photographs. The studio soon became a place of incredible sorting and organization. I would make about 50 of these every day for several months and organize them into tables in the studio. I initially thought that groupings of 7 by 7 would be a good way to approach making modules for the project, but that proved unwieldy, and soon I went on to the 5 by 5. The 5 by 5 gave me several important rules. There would always be a central image that was somewhat circular in the middle. There would be black and white imagery and color imagery, at least one text, and then groupings of images horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. In the studio, the project began to take form. It could either be on a single wall or built into a corner, or in a row, such as a decorative border for wallpaper. And at some point, I realized that the project was ready to be proposed to a venue, and the regional was coming up. So this image, which was made by my student, Dan Rothbart, proposed a large-scale version of Imitation of Life for the gallery on the upper floor of the museum, which is one of my favorite museum spaces in the world. The sorting process continued, breaking out images into groups of color, black and white, linked units, texts, and centers. And eventually they were packed and ready to be transported to the museum. Setup occurred about a week before the opening, and worked with my studio assistants, Carla Dordick and Jude Dagnot. And our primary tool for assembly was the binder clip and the push pin. Initially, we worked with the individual sheets of 25, but soon we realized that it was best to tape 3 or 4 of these together at a time to make for a more level line. Once again, I'm Michael Oatman, and we're standing here in front of the Albany Institute's installation of Imitation of Life, or the fossil record. It's 2,100 images in groups of 25, and this is part of a much larger work which has 3,250 images and about 130 assemblies of 25. The project, as I mentioned, began as a kind of spring cleaning, but it very quickly became something else. As I looked at 100 years of magazines, periodicals that I had acquired from my archive or that my parents owned, which I inherited several years ago when they passed, I was really struck in some cases by how little had changed in, let's say, 50 years' time. Images of riots from the Democratic Convention, police attacking people of color. These were startlingly familiar and unchanged images. I noticed that there was this incredible kind of correspondence to our own time, and sometimes images were about predicting the future, sometimes they were documents from the deep past. In addition to cutting out thousands of images, I also saved the captions from each item that I called. So for instance, in this one, the caption reads, "Showing the effects of the final assassination attempt, Hitler has to shake with his left hand at a subsequent meeting. The little guy with his arm extended is Goebbels. The smiling terrorist with glasses left center is Himmler." So, as you can imagine, the captions become as inane as advertising copy for Oreo cookies, or for images of Lincoln throughout his life as he aged. There were articles representing emerging feminism, the general worldwide political sphere, and a lot of illustrations that were actually kind of early versions of what we do now regularly with Photoshop. So it's a really remarkable spread of images that was both kind of dizzying to work with and really grounding as I was spending, all of my time alone working on this project every day for several months. So under normal conditions, I'd be in this room with an audience, and we'd be able to talk about the piece, have a question and answer session. And I'd probably ask, what's your entry point here? It might be generational. There's hundreds of images up here which might have very little meaning for a younger person. And then a great deal more, somebody of my generation might really encounter lots of associations and source memories and maybe even plot events in their own life against this as a kind of graph. The entry point that I chose was this group of 25, which were taken from that original group of 7 by 7 that I began playing with, wondering what was the right size for a module. 49 images seemed a little bit too large, so I eventually settled on 5 by 5. And a lot of the rules for the project came out of this particular piece. So I decided that every group of 25 would have a circular kind of center point that would be pretty obvious, that there would be a mixture of color and black and white, that there would be conjunctions of 2 or more images horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, or in blocks, and that there would be some sort of text or number, and often a kind of graphic. So this was the rule set that I followed pretty rigorously. Of course, the trick became introducing a wider range of time into each group of 25. So some of them are quite expansive, others focus on the 1940s or wartime. And again, to the viewers who aren't in the room with me, when you come in and take a look at the piece, I'd be curious to hear what your point of entry was, what routes you began to follow in this paper internet. Thank you.